My name is Samuel, and I serve as a forensic technician at a morgue located in the center of New York. I have been in this profession for a decade, witnessing events that most people can only envision in their worst nightmares. However, what transpired in 2014 caused me to reevaluate everything: my logic, my sanity, and even my choice to continue in this field. I had never experienced fear in my own skin until that night, when I realized there are phenomena that defy explanation and perhaps should remain undiscovered. It was a rainy evening, the type of heavy, persistent rain that seems to wash away any evidence of life from the streets. Late that night, I received a body which wasn't entirely out of the ordinary. It was a man without any identification, discovered in an alley downtown. The most disturbing aspect was that, despite having been the victim of a severe beating, his face was an unidentifiable mass of bruised flesh and torn skin. His head was the only area of his body where there were any injuries or defensive wounds, as if someone had let all of their anger out on him without giving him a chance to defend himself. Since the morgue was empty that night and my coworker Jones had called in sick, I made the decision to begin the autopsy right away. I didn't mind working alone because there was something almost calming about the mechanical routine of my job. Open, analyze, record, close. Close, but something felt off the minute I opened the plastic bag containing the body that night. It smelled strange, not like the typical scent of a fresh corpse, but more acidic, as if the body had begun to decompose at an unusually fast rate. I started dictating the case details after turning on my recorder. As I spoke, I had the strange feeling that I wasn't alone in the room. It was ridiculous, of course, that the morgue was totally locked down and that I had personally turned on the building security system when I got there. But even so, every movement I made felt like something was following me. The man was about 40 years old, unidentified, and had multiple head and facial injuries without any indication of defense wounds. The way it lay there made me feel as though I was watching, even though his eyes were closed as they should be and his head tilted slightly in an odd direction toward me. It's not like corpses can truly express anything. Disregarding the pain, I started cleaning the skin in order to inspect the wounds. I halted and turned to face the dry sound emanating from the rear of the room containing the refrigerated body lockers, hoping it was simply a temperature change causing the metal to contract. I took a deep breath and forced myself to concentrate. Perhaps I was simply too exhausted to finish right away. The atmosphere changed as soon as I picked up the scalpel to make the first cut. It became denser and heavier, and my fingers shook. As I leaned down to get it back, the scalpel fell out of my hand and clattered to the ground. My throat tightened with breath. The corpse's hands, which had been limp at his side only moments before, were now crossed over his chest. I froze. No one else was in the room and I hadn't moved him. I tried to tell myself that perhaps I hadn't noticed that I had put his arms in that position before, but I knew deep down that I had done it, so I forced myself to go ahead and finish the first incision. The silence was broken just as I opened the abdominal cavity by a muffled groan. I jerked upright and spun toward the door, thinking someone had entered, but the room was empty when I noticed something. Not only were the corpse's eyes open, but they were staring at me. My mind frantically tried to come up with a logical explanation. Perhaps the eyelids hadn't been completely closed and had opened due to involuntary post-mortem muscle relaxation. That I tried to resume my work, but I couldn't get rid of the overwhelming feeling that something invisible was in the room with me watching. Then, the security alarm I had set off when I arrived was suddenly off. Someone or something had disabled it. I hurried back to the autopsy room, determined to finish quickly and leave, but as soon as I stepped inside, a chill went through me. The corpse was no longer on the table. The plastic bag had arrived empty on the floor, and my mind was left empty, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. I looked around the room in an attempt to convince myself that I had somehow messed up and that the body had just moved, but that didn't make sense. Bodies don't simply vanish. And then I noticed it in the room's darkest corner. The body was standing straight, its head cocked at an odd angle, and its once pale, lifeless skin had turned reddish, as though blood had somehow returned to it. I wanted to run, but my legs felt paralyzed. Instead, my body took an involuntary step back, knocking over a tray of surgical tools. The loud crash didn't startle the figure watching me from the shadows. I shut my eyes tight, wishing that when I opened them, everything would be back to normal, that the body would return to the table, and that this would all be an illusion caused by exhaustion. However, when I opened my eyes, it was closer. I could make out its face, or what remained of it. Its lips twisted into something that was neither a smile nor a grimace, but something far worse, something mocking and inhuman. I stumbled backward, blindly reaching for the door, and somehow managed to pull it open and escape into the hallway, not stopping until I reached the main exit. As I raced down the stairs, I heard a heavy thud from the autopsy room, as if something large had crashed to the floor, but I didn't dare to go back. I burst outside into the rain, gasping for breath, letting the downpour drench my clothes. Then I saw it through the morgue's glass doors. The autopsy table was back to its original position, the corpse lying quietly with its eyes shut as if nothing had ever happened. I checked the security video, but the footage from that night was corrupted. The electronic logs revealed no irregularities. When I reported the incident to my superiors, they assumed I had made an error due to fatigue. I didn't argue. Who would take me seriously? Since then, I have kept working at the morgue, but I never stay alone at night. I refuse to ever go through anything like that again. Yet sometimes when I try to sleep, I get the unsettling feeling that someone is standing at the foot of my bed, watching me with those same eyes that should have never opened again. My name is Sarah, and I've been working in a morgue in Chicago for more than 10 years. It's a profession that few prefer and many dread. Most nights glide by in complete silence, accompanied solely by the steady hum of fluorescent lights. However, some nights alter everything you believe about the world, leaving you with questions that remain unanswered. This is the account of one such night. It was 2009, a typical Friday, or at least that's how it seemed at the start of my shift. The air felt thick and muggy, making everything seem heavier. I could sense that a storm was approaching by the smell of wet earth filtering through the window cracks. Around 10 p.m., I got a call informing me that a new body was on its way. The ambulance arrived a few minutes later, its tires screeching against the asphalt, and two paramedics brought out a stretcher draped with a white sheet. At that moment, the atmosphere appeared to grow more frigid. It was the body of a young woman, no older than 30, based on the initial report that indicated she had died in a car accident. As I wheeled her into the autopsy room, I felt as though the eyes of a religious painting on the wall were following me, as if judging something I didn't understand. The right side of her face was severely disfigured, and the dried blood created a disturbing contrast against her pale skin. But something about her didn't fit something I couldn't quite define. The storm outside broke just as I started going over her case. The room was briefly illuminated by file lightning, and the rain continued to beat relentlessly against the roof. Ms. Hart was her name, and she lived alone in a downtown apartment. And based on the records, she had no close relatives, so there was no more death to add to the statistics. However, there was something unsettling about her case that I couldn't ignore, so I went ahead with the examination. Her injuries were consistent with the report. A severe blow to the skull, multiple rib fractures, but when I started cleaning her face for the forensic photos, I noticed something odd. Her skin had intricate symbols that looked like they were etched by someone using a fine needle. The medical report didn't mention them, and they appeared too precise to be unintentional scars. I attempted to ignore it and carry on with my work, but as I completed the reports, a sound drew me in even more. My heart was racing as I turned to face the autopsy table. I realized that Hart's body was exactly where I had left it, motionless beneath the sheet. I slowly got to my feet, feeling foolish for even considering checking again. But my curiosity overcame me. I walked over to the table and pulled back the sheet. And although her eyes were still closed and her body was still lifeless, I took a deep breath and told myself that it was all in my head. However, as I turned away, I noticed that her hand was rigid and stiff, and that it had moved slightly as if it was reaching for something. I had seen post-mortem twitches before, and it wasn't uncommon for corpses to have muscle spasms, but what happened next stunned me. From across the room, my gaze stayed locked on her. I had witnessed bodies move before, as it was part of my job, but this was different. This was deliberate, as if Letitia was trying to communicate something. I remained frozen, unable to turn away or even move. Then the crying started again, louder this time, and it was emanating directly from her. The lights flickered violently as the storm outside intensified, creating an atmosphere in the room that felt thick, heavy, and suffocating. While Letitia's body stayed motionless, a profound sense that something was deeply wrong permeated every corner of the space. Gathering all the bravery I had left, I moved closer. There were no hints of life, but her expression had shifted. Her once serene face now bore a twisted grimace, resembling either a smirk or an expression of torment. I couldn't quite tell which. I attempted to pray, something that usually helped when everything felt too overwhelming, but the words eluded me. My throat constricted, and fear paralyzed my entire body. Then I noticed another detail. The symbols etched on her skin were darkening, as if being carved more deeply with each second. In a bid to regain control of the situation, I resolved to review her case file again. Perhaps I had overlooked something that could clarify the situation. I examined every line in detail, and then I discovered it in the part that listed her personal effects. It noted that Letitia had been wearing a small amulet at the time of her death, yet there was no amulet among the items that were returned with her body. I went through her clothing and the plastic evidence bag containing her belongings, but found nothing. Then I recalled something the paramedics had mentioned casually when they brought her in. The accident was peculiar, as if the car had been propelled by something rather than crashing on its own. Suddenly, all the fragments fell into place in a horrifying manner. Letitia was not merely an ordinary victim. Something else played a role in her death, something that hadn't been disclosed in the reports, and whatever it was remained in this place. The storm outside reached its peak, and abruptly, the lights went out entirely, plunging me into utter darkness. The crying had ceased, replaced by something worse. An overwhelming, suffocating pressure in the atmosphere. as if something invisible had filled the room. I understood that I was not alone. Though I couldn't see it, I was certain it was present. When the lights flickered back on, Letitia remained on the table, but something had changed. Her face no longer bore that eerie smirk. Now it looked tranquil and serene, and the symbols on her skin had disappeared, and I gazed at her for what felt like an eternity, attempting to comprehend the events that had just unfolded. I'm uncertain whether it was simply my mind attempting to make sense of what occurred, or if I had genuinely witnessed something beyond comprehension. However, I am aware that after that night, something within me shifted. I never included what transpired in my report. No one would have believed me. But since that night, every time I enter the morgue and sense the change in the air, I remember Letitia. I contemplate the mysteries we cannot elucidate, the tales concealed within places like this. Each time I find myself alone with a corpse, I whisper a silent prayer, not only for them but also for myself, because there are certain things that ought to remain hidden, yet sometimes they manage to resurface. My name is Susan, and I have been working in a morgue in New Orleans for the last decade. Throughout the years, I've realized that death can sometimes feel as routine as a regular office job, but there are moments when it challenges everything you think you know. I don't typically believe in superstitions, but an incident from 2017 is something I can't shake off. I don't even want to forget it. It was a humid night in August, with the air feeling stifling. A storm had caused power flickers, making the morgue feel heavier than usual. My shift began as always, with endless paperwork and routine body verifications. Then, a new body arrived, but this one came with more caution than details. The paramedics left in a hurry, almost as if they were eager to get away from it. In all my years working here, I had never experienced anything like it. The body belonged to a man named Leonard Pierce, who had been the leader of a small local cult I had heard rumors about but never took seriously. According to the report, he died from cardiac arrest, yet the forensic examiner noted that his heart showed no signs of failure. That was peculiar, but what really grabbed my attention was a prominent warning at the bottom of his file: "Do not embalm." There was no medical rationale given, no additional instructions, just that one caution. I had never encountered anything like it before. Leonard had been rumored to be involved in dark rituals, but I focused on science rather than folklore. The body was in impeccable condition, too impeccable as he had been deceased for over 24 hours, yet there was no rigidity in his muscles and no indication of decay. His skin was pale but not the usual gray tint most bodies develop. It was as if he were merely sleeping, as though he might awaken at any moment. I set aside my unease and got ready for my task. There was no rational reason to avoid embalming him since cult beliefs shouldn't interfere with my work. I arranged my instruments and commenced the procedure, which was when complications began to arise. Initially, it was subtle. The body felt peculiar, almost as if it were resisting. Not in a physical sense, but the skin had an unusual texture and the emanating fluids didn't drain correctly. Yet, I pressed on, convincing myself it was just another cadaver, or at least that's what I told myself. Then, as midnight struck, the storm outside escalated, causing the windows to rattle and thunder to crash so forcefully that I flinched. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I turned, expecting to find that I had accidentally knocked something over, but everything remained in its designated spot except for one item. A storage compartment door was ajar. I could have sworn I had closed it earlier. I approached and shut it tightly, but when I turned back to the autopsy table, I froze. Gregory's arms were positioned differently. I hadn't shifted him. I tried to convince myself that perhaps I had placed them like that and simply hadn't noticed, but somewhere deep down, I understood that wasn't accurate. The lights flickered again, and then every metal tool on my table crashed to the floor. There was no reason for that occurrence, as the table was steady. My hand trembled as I bent down to retrieve them. I was about to push myself to continue my task, but then I noticed Gregory's face. His eyes, which had been closed upon arrival, were now slightly ajar, just enough for me to glimpse the shine of his pupils beneath his lids. It was incomprehensible. I stepped back from the body. The atmosphere in the room felt dense, almost stifling. The lights flickered violently, and the thunder outside was overwhelming. I had witnessed post-mortem muscle contractions before, but this was not the same. I reached out to grasp his arm, seeking to reassure myself that his body remained lifeless, but as soon as my fingers touched his skin, my stomach churned that he wasn't chilly. His body was not rigid. Rather, his muscles felt taut, as if something still lingered within him. That's when the doors to the autopsy room swung open abruptly. I flinched, my heart racing. There was no breeze and no one else in the building, yet the doors moved by themselves. The shadows in the room shifted with each lightning flash. Then I glanced back at the body and my blood ran cold. Gregory's head had turned toward me, his lips slightly parted, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though he was grinning. That was enough. I bolted, abandoning everything behind. I couldn't care less about my job. I had no interest in seeking explanations. All I wanted was to escape. I never shared what occurred that night. No one would have believed me. However, since that evening, every time a thunderstorm strikes, I recall Gregory's eyes and the sensation that something from beyond death was observing me. Certain things ought to remain hidden, but sometimes death isn't powerful enough to keep them buried. I have spent most of my life working in morgues, a job that terrifies most people as it involves facing death up close each day. But for me, it became routine. The deceased had already confronted their worst experiences, experiencing no pain or fear, just the stark, mechanical process of examination. However, in 1998, something occurred in a small-town morgue in Nebraska that has stayed with me ever since. Even now, I question whether it was real or simply a trick of our fatigued minds, but I know it was genuine because what followed me after that night still haunts me. That evening began like any other. I arrived at the morgue around 8 p.m., an old, small facility, one of those government buildings that seem to have been lost to time. The fluorescent lights flickered from time to time, and the air remained perpetually cold, even during the summer months. My supervisor had already completed his shift, leaving me in charge of the establishment, though I wasn't entirely by myself. Adam, a newer assistant, was with me who had a tendency to take things lightly, a trait I thought was unsuitable for this line of work. For the first hour, everything was straightforward. We were setting up instruments for the following day when we received a call. An ambulance was en route with the body of a young girl who had been in a car accident. A tragic but not unusual occurrence. Yet, something in the officer's voice instilled a sense of dread in me. He mentioned the accident had taken place on a remote road outside of town, and when they found her, she was by herself, but the tire marks on the pavement indicated that someone else had been present. Nobody knew who she was. She had no identification, no personal items, Nothing that could reveal her identity when the ambulance arrived. She was placed on a gurney and covered with a sheet when Adam and I went to pick up the body. We moved her to the autopsy room to get ready for the routine intake. But as soon as we opened her face, I felt a chill that wasn't related to the cold moor air. Her eyes, despite the fact that her body was pale and bruised, were wide open and gray. Not a soft, cloudy gray, but a deep, unnatural shade that made it seem like they weren't from this world. Her eyes were dead, but she was looking at us. She shook off the feeling and carried on with the routine, which was unusual for Adam. We positioned the body on the metal examination table and began the intake procedure. That's when something small yet disturbing occurred. A faint noise, reminiscent of something light dropping to the floor, caught our attention. Both Adam and I turned towards the sound. A scalpel, which had been securely placed on the tray just moments earlier, was now lying several feet away on the ground. Initially, I dismissed it, thinking we must have inadvertently knocked it over, but then it happened again. This time, an entire tray of instruments slid off the counter and crashed to the floor, and neither of us had touched it. The lights flickered once, then twice, followed by a giggle, a high-pitched, playful sound reminiscent of a child's laughter. That noise left me frozen in place. I glanced at Adam, who had also heard it. His grip on the clipboard was tight, his knuckles turning pale. We both directed our gaze towards the closed door, where it seemed the giggle had originated. I chose not to voice my thoughts, preferring to ignore it. I forced myself to continue working, but my hands felt clumsy, as if something was actively trying to hinder my focus. A few minutes later, as I was examining the girl's body, the lights went out completely, leaving us in complete darkness. The only light I could find was a faint glow from a street lamp outside the window. I cursed and went to the light switch, assuming it was just a power outage, but as I stumbled and looked down, I noticed several medical trays scattered on the floor that didn't make sense because they had been securely placed on the counter. The lights flickered back on, and I followed Adam's terrified expression, and my stomach dropped. Her cheek bruises appeared less severe, as if her skin were healing. Trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination, I leaned in closer, but as I got closer, I noticed something even worse. Her eyes had moved. They were still open, but now they were staring at me. The air was filled with a humming sound that felt like a silent, vibrating force pressing against my skull. Adam remained motionless, gazing at the girl as though he were seeing something otherworldly. That's when I realized we were not alone. I attempted to shut the girl's eyelids again. It was an instinctive response, a frantic effort to bring back normalcy. But as soon as my fingers touched her skin, it felt like her gaze pierced through my hand, as if she could still perceive me even with her eyes closed. I stumbled backward, knocking over more tools. I was frozen in place. I don't know how long we stood there, but eventually, I took hold of Adam's arm and dragged him toward the exit. We left the autopsy room without glancing back. The following morning, we returned with our supervisor and tried to recount what had occurred, but he dismissed us, of course. However, when we entered the room, everything appeared normal. The trays were arranged neatly, the lights functioned properly, and the girl's body looked entirely ordinary. Yet her eyes, despite her being officially declared dead, conveyed a sense that she was still aware, as if she had witnessed our presence, as if she was still anticipating something. After that night, I never dared to look into a corpse's eyes again. Some nights, regardless of how much time goes by, you can't shake off those memories. No matter how fervently you attempt to bury them in the depths of your mind, they always resurface.